Welcome everybody this afternoon. My name is Miguel Brugarolas. I'm professor of theology at the University of Navarre. And it is for me a great pleasure to chair this session. I introduce to you Marcus Plested, who is already well known. He is a professor of Greek, patristic, and Byzantine theology at Marquette University. Dr. Plested was at school in London and went on to read modern history, followed by theology. Okay. Great.
That's better. Perfect.
So Marcus Plested was at school in London and went on to read modern history, followed by theology at Merton College, Oxford. He took his doctorate from Oxford in 1999 with a thesis on the Macarian homilies supervised by Bishop Callistus. He was at the Center of Theological Inquiry and the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, and has taught, lectured, and published widely in patristic, Byzantine, and modern Orthodox theology. He was received into the Orthodox Church in 1992. He is the author, among many other things, of the following books today: The Macarian Legacy, the place of Macarius Simeon in the Eastern Christian tradition, and Orthodox reading of Aquinas, and Wisdom in Christian tradition, the patristic roots in modern Russian sociology. All these three books by Oxford University Press. It's for me a pleasure to introduce him, and I give him the word. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you to everyone who organized this conference, to Giulio and Khaled, Ilaria. And thanks to Father Thomas Joseph White for this wonderful book. Father Thomas Joseph and I actually overlapped in Oxford, and we even did a little Greek reading class together many years ago. Last century, I could say. Now, it scarcely needs repeating that Father Thomas Joseph White's book is a monumental achievement. It's a splendid and paradigmatic instance of Thomistic ressourcement, amply showing the power of Aquinas' thought to animate, shape, and inspire Christian reflection on the past, present, and future of Trinitarian theology. While it's not a theology on one's knees, as he puts it, it's certainly a work oriented on the divine wisdom. Aquinas began all of his major works with the theme of wisdom. And this salutary practice is emulated by Father Thomas Joseph in his introduction, which nicely sets up wisdom. Father Serge-Thomas said this on the first night, although I'm glad that not too much of what I'm going to say has already been said by other people. The introduction sets up wisdom as something of a master theme for the whole volume. The book's a deeply revealing account of Christian Trinitarian theology through the ages, profoundly helpful on the question of analogy in general and the psychological analogy in particular. It contains some bracing and I think largely merited critique of figures such as Barth and Rana on the one hand, and von Balthasar and Mortman on the other. I also found the writing not unlike that of Aquinas, limpid, painstakingly reasoned, clearly structured, and disciplined, albeit with occasional notes of delicious exuberance and the odd, slightly mischievous aside. It's of course a huge tome, even a kind of summer in itself. I would say it's unputdownable, but it's quite heavy, so you do have to put it down from time to time. All in all, and speaking as an outsider to the Catholic Thomist tradition, I would say it's a worthy tribute to the angelic doctor himself. The book is, of course, Catholic, big C, and specifically Thomist account of the Trinity. Even so, I was a little taken aback to see Thomas, along with various modern interlocutors, take up well over 500 pages, and the first 2,000 years of biblical, patristic, and early medieval reflection on the nature and mystery of God, reduced to mere 130 pages or so. The 12 pages bridging the 800 years between Augustine and Aquinas were particularly disorienting in their rapid pace. It seems to me, and I'll explain why in a minute, that a good deal of highly significant Trinitarian theology is lost sight of in the process. It can, at times, read like a bit of a theological juggernaut, or perhaps a hurtling troika, at the end of Gogol's Dead Souls, with alternative viewpoints swatted away and other ecclesial traditions scattering before the relentless perfection and implacable progress of the Thomist machine. That said, I do want to recognize the author's expressed desire to pursue Thomistic ressourcement with collegiality and ecumenical sensitivity. But he does indeed swat away many alternative viewpoints. He does try and give those vibrant viewpoints. Incidentally, I like the word vibrant. For me, that was code for interesting but wrong. But he's concerned to give those vibrant viewpoints their due, and in general gives far more credence to non-Catholic writers than would be conceivable in a Thomist work written, say, a century ago. From the Orthodox standpoint, this includes some brief discussion of Sergius Bulgakov and John Zizoulas, along with occasional references to figures such as Vladimir Nosky, Dimitri Saniloe, and John Weindorf. Perhaps more significantly, his patristic references expressly include some of the Greek fathers, notably the Cappadocian fathers, although I'll query what he means by the Cappadocian fathers later. St. Maximus the Confessor received some attention, and even later Roman, or if you insist, Byzantine, fathers get a look in, such as Gregory of Cyprus and Gregory of Palamas. And this appeal to the Greek patristic tradition is, I think, made with something of an eye on the Orthodox. As Aquinas himself recommended, when speaking with the Greeks, one must argue not only from Latin, but also from Greek patristic sources. There are nonetheless many important elements and insights from the Eastern Christian tradition that are simply left out. And one is left wishing that the reflection on the Greek patristic and modern Orthodox sources had been much expanded, for the book, in other words, to be a little more universal, a little more small c Catholic. In what follows, I shall begin with a point-by-point discussion before turning to a more substantive argument concerning a significant trajectory in patristic Trinitarian theology that I find to have been entirely overlooked in this book. I will then conclude with a very brief comment, the very question of Trinitarian ontology, which is rightly given a question mark in the colloquium title. And let me begin with the theme I mentioned already, wisdom. The introduction distinguishes three ascending forms of wisdom, corresponding to philosophy, theology, and the supernatural gift of infused wisdom. What we do not find here, although it does crop up elsewhere, is the idea of God himself as wisdom, self-giving wisdom. Infused wisdom is presented, after Aquinas, as above all affective, as a co-natural knowledge born of affective love. Happily, and unlike many of his contemporaries, Aquinas resisted the temptation to disassociate wisdom from knowledge, sapientia from scientia, and Father Thomas Joseph followed him in this respect. There is nonetheless in Western scholasticism, including the Thomist tradition, an undeniable tendency to juxtapose and contrast, if not entirely separate, the intellective cognitive and the affective mystical aspects of the approach to God. And this is a tendency that the Orthodox tradition, I suggest, has been comparatively free from. One result of this bifurcation is a functional downgrading of mystical experience as a potentially normative source of theological reflection and indeed dogmatic formulation. I was, for example, astonished to read on page 4 that mystical union with God, however exalted, is not a substitute for genuine philosophical or theological understanding. I could not help but recall the starkly different claim expressed by Vladimir Nosky in the introduction to his mystical theology. The Eastern Church, far from being mutually opposed, theology and mysticism support and complete one another. One is impossible without the other. While Father Thomas Joseph is surely right to warn against taking any and all claims of mystical experience at face value, it's for this Orthodox theologian, at any rate, shocking to see scholarly theologians elevated above the mystics, the latter serving as mere reference points, quote, for the former. While mystical experience must certainly be received within and weighed against the overarching scriptural, theological, liturgical, and ascetic inheritance of the Church, it seems very odd to me to deny that those who experience direct union with God are anything but the highest, truest, and most genuine of theologians. All this comes as part of a distinctly Thomistic commitment to Catholic Christianity, which is commended as the living practice of natural reasoning about God. As such, Catholic Christianity is seen to offer the best antidote to the acathia of the modern liberal secular sphere, and the best answer for the highest yearnings of the human being. Catholic Christianity is furthermore declared to be, of all religions, quote, the most reasonable, the most mystical, that is to say, the religion that is the most compelling for human rationality, and at the same time presents us with the truth about God as Trinity, that wholly surpasses the natural powers and acquisitions of human rationality. The mystical here seems to pertain chiefly to the revealed character of knowledge of God as Trinity, a knowledge that will always surpass our ability to comprehend or express. What we do not find in the book, it seems to me, is any developed theology of mystical union or deification, theosis, or any treatment of the nous, or spiritual intellect, that supra-rational faculty in man, capable of direct and unmediated apprehension of God. These are themes beloved of the Greek fathers, and certainly also to be found in the Latin tradition. I wonder what Thomas himself might have said about this functional downplaying of mystical union, given his own experience of mystical encounter. The report is in the earliest life of Thomas. On the 6th of December 1273, he had a vision at the conclusion of Mass for the feast of St. Nicholas, led to him abandoning the Summa Theologiae project. His recognition that all his laboured work of rational inquiry was but straw compared to what he had seen. Is it really true then that mystical union with God, however exalted, is not a substitute for genuine philosophical and theological understanding? One may also note that the book pays relatively little attention to Thomas's historical context, aesthetic background, or liturgical compositions. It's also very restrained in its use of scriptural commentary. It makes no use, so far as I can see, of the Catena Aurea. I mention the Catena Aurea because it's something of a showcase for Thomas's own immersion in Greek patristic sources, especially from the early 1260s onwards, what I've called elsewhere his Greek patristic turn. And this immersion, I think, goes deeper than the book allows. Take the treatment of the Transfiguration, for example, and of course this is the image we'll be looking at all the time, but I don't think we've actually spoken about the Transfiguration thus far, at least not in any detail. So the Transfiguration in the book is briefly dealt with in a few sentences and is summed up as follows. Jesus is illumined from within by the miraculous glorification of his body and soul, so as to indicate proleptically the future mystery, the resurrection. And this comment, it seems to me, looks rather thin compared to what Thomas himself says on the topic, leaning especially on St. John of Damascus, his homily on the Transfiguration. So the Damascene is the leading authority on the Transfiguration, cited in the Catena on Luke. Is also behind much of what Thomas has to say on the question in question 45 of the third part of the Summa Theologiae, but not long before he abandoned the project. The light of Tabor, Thomas asserts, on the authority of the Damascene, derived from his divinity and even overflowed from his divinity into the body. Thomas supplements John's emphasis on the divine character of the light of the Transfiguration with a reference from Augustine in a different context concerning the outpouring of light from the glory of the soul of the resurrection. And he does not, in my reading, fully reconcile the two accounts. While tolerating a certain level of paradox here, he clearly takes the Transfiguration as far more than a prolepsis of the resurrection glory of the saints, emphasizing rather the revelation of the Godhead in the effulgence of divine light. You can see it from the icon here. Little bit, I think, comes through in the book's rather brief account of the Transfiguration, which does not reference Thomas at this point. Indeed, I wonder if the Thomas of the book isn't a little too neat at times. On the question of the Transfiguration, Thomas is more expansive, more broadly patristic, and less tidy than he's generally presented in the book. One might even suggest that his Greek patristic turn contributed in some way to his shattering mystical experience at the end of 1273, but any suggestion of that kind, of course, would be rank heresy for the modern Thomist. Of course, one cannot move too far into the area of Trinitarian theology without encountering the problems of the filioque. We talked about the filioque yesterday. And I must pay tribute to the many helpful clarifications the book provides as to the nature of Latin teaching on the filioque and the question of its place in the creed. The book's account preserves something of Augustine's sense of the procession of the Holy Spirit principaliter as to principle, or fontal principle, as the author calls it, but also emphasizing that the addition should be understood more in liturgical terms than as an act of raw papal authority over and against that of an ecumenical council. So there's much here in the book that allays some of the cruder orthodox charges against the filioque, even if it remains utterly uncompromising in its commitment to the doctrine of the double procession as if from one principle. That said, I was a little surprised to see that St. John the Evangelist clearly teaches the doctrine. Cappadocian stance on the doctrine remains simply moot. This perspective leans heavily on the principle, which we were discussing earlier, that temporal missions necessarily reflect eternal processions. This is not, of course, as we've seen already, Rahner's the economic trinity is the immanent trinity, and vice versa. White does a great job of dismantling that particular old chestnut. But it remains problematic, it seems to me, and here I'll probably chime with some of what Christophe was saying earlier, to put so much stress on temporal missions, given that the Holy Spirit is in some sense sends the Son at the Annunciation coming upon and overshadowing Mary, the one born of her shall be called the Son of God, Luke 1:35. Surely this particular advent, this particular mission has some bearing upon Trinitarian theology, but I did not see it referenced in the book. And staying with the Filioque for a moment, this is actually in support of some of the book's outreach to the East on this point. White rightly associates St. Gregory Palamas with St. Gregory of Cyprus in terms of the eternal manifestation or shining forth of the Spirit through the Son, articulated at the Council of Lacernae in 1285 as part of its repudiation of the Reunion Council of Lyons in 1274. And the position of the Council of Lacernae is indeed far from the rigid monopatrism of St. Photius the Great, procession from the Father and only from the Father. But Palamas's contribution is hardly limited to simply repeating the formulations of Lacernae, Toma 1285. In chapter 36 of the 150 chapters, he likens the Holy Spirit to an ineffable love, or eros, of the begetter between the begotten towards the begotten. The affinity to St. Augustine here is tangible, and indeed we know that Palamas had access to Augustine's De Trinitate in Greek translation. The Son, writes Palamas, possesses this love as co-proceeding from the Father, and from himself, and as resting co-naturally in him. Thus the Holy Spirit is not only of the Father, but also of the Son. This does not, he's careful to note, detract in any way from the fact that the Spirit proceeds from the Father alone, according to his existence, hyparxis. As he explains in his anti-Latin and Buddhistic treatises, to claim otherwise, as the Latins do with the Filioque, is to make a single hypostasis of the Father and the Son. But we can nonetheless, says Palamas, speak of the Spirit being from the Father through the Son, or even from the Father and the Son, in terms of the eternal divine life, and not only in terms of the economy. Because of the consubstantiality of Father and Son, the Spirit may even be said to be naturally from the Son and from his essence, manifesting thereby the Spirit's own consubstantiality with the Father and the Son. All this amounts to what I called elsewhere an orthodox Filioque that might constructively be brought into dialogue with Father Thomas Joseph's presentation of the Filioque question. And in Father Thomas Joseph's presentation, Filioque question, Thomas has proposed that the kind of conceptual bridge between Greek East and Latin West. And I suggest that Palamas too might serve in that same function. Let's turn now again to the early church, to what Father Thomas Joseph at least one point calls the early Catholic Church, big C. So I must admit I'd be careful about speaking about the early Orthodox Church, although in a sense I think that was true. Anyhow, here I want to query the consistent rendition of the Nicene formula, homoousion to patri, as one in being with the Father, rather than the more literal and accurate same in essence. Well, no one can say precisely what the Fathers of Constantinople intended by the term, say perhaps that they knew that Arius didn't like it and wouldn't accept it. This prefix, homo, without question denotes not oneness, but sameness. And sameness is not quite the same as oneness, and it's used with the dative to patri, to or with the Father, emphasizes in the first instance not so much the oneness of divine being as relation to the person of the Father as the sole fount and causal principle of the Godhead. All this is very delicate, but it's important to dwell on here, since the book uses the form one in being. in a very particular sense, convey not only oneness of nature or essence, but also oneness of individual being, something more clearly implied in the Latin substantia than the Greek ousia. And of course, the Latin substantia etymologically is equivalent to the Greek hypostasis. Well, Father Thomas Joseph may well be reflecting Thomas's teaching accurately here. One in individual being is certainly not an accurate gloss of the creedal term itself. The fact that the Council of Chalcedon in the following century uses homoousios of the Son in relation to us humans, according to his humanity, further undermines the association of the term in its creedal setting with oneness of individual being. So there's so much more that could be said about multiple aspects of this tremendous book. I found he kept the oneness and threeness of God wonderfully together, and much appreciated the spirited defense of divine impassibility in particular. Father Thomas Joseph brilliantly exposes the flaws in Barth and Rowan and in Baldassar and Moltmann. And many of these flaws are alleged to derive from the medieval period, with Duns Scotus and William of Ockham being singled out as particularly problematic forebears. Be that as it may, in these modern theologians, taking their cue from Hegel, history somehow becomes constitutive of God in these modern thinkers, none of whom is able to escape fully from Kant's effective prohibition on properly Trinitarian thinking. The notion of inverted monophysitism in this context is a particularly striking contribution. Only the psychological analogy, on Father Thomas Joseph's account, offers a tangible and trustworthy way of breaking through the Kantian impasse. It is his contention that the Thomist solution, and especially the psychological analogy, is the only real way out of this impasse, and that this solution has not really been tried in the modern context. But is the psychological analogy really all we have to go on? Are there other ways of talking about God and his eternal divine life that might prove even more effective than the Thomist solution? And here I turn back to the Cappadocian Fathers. The term Cappadocian Fathers as a grouping, as a way of grouping in Basil, Caesarea, St. Gregory of Nazianzus, St. Gregory of Nyssa, the late usage, going back only as far as the 19th century. Much more ancient is the Orthodox practice of grouping St. Basil, St. Gregory of Nazianzus, and St. John Chrysostom together. It's the three holy hierarchs. The West, of course, adds St. Athanasius. You know, the West likes adding things. Adds Athanasius in its own list of the four great Greek doctors of the Church. St. Gregory of Nyssa, who I often refer to as the patron saint of modern systematic theology, is mythic. The main point here is that when Father Thomas Joseph speaks of the Cappadocian Fathers, he invariably means St. Gregory of Nazianzus in practice. And he describes St. Gregory of Nazianzus on one particular point at least as being more agreeable than St. Gregory of Nyssa. And there's nothing wrong, of course, with honouring St. Gregory of Nazianzus. He is singularly hailed as the theologian, after all. It's even refreshing to see St. Gregory the theologian getting the lion's share of the attention, when so much of the focus in modern theology has been on he of Nyssa. But it is problematic to focus on the theologian in a way that elides some of the significant differences that exist in the Cappadocian Fathers and their various approaches to the mystery of God. And here I advert in particular to the notions of divine simplicity and divine unknowability. In their reaction to Eunomius, who claimed a degree of certain knowledge of the divine, all three Cappadocians were led to emphasize the utter unknowability of the divine essence, the divine ousia. In Basil and Gregory of Nyssa, but not so obviously in the theologian, this radical apatheticism was balanced by a sense of the partial knowability of the divine attributes or the glories pertaining to the essence, wisdom, power, goodness, etc. The essence is to be distinguished from the three hypostases or persons to whom the essence is common and in whom the glories pertaining to the essence are manifest. As Basil puts it, the only begotten is the image of the invisible God, an image not of bodily form, but of the very divinity, and of the glories pertaining to the essence of God, an image of power, an image of wisdom. As Christ is called the power of God and the wisdom of God. Basil here maintains that God remains unknown in his essence, his ousia, while making himself known in the glories that pertain to the essence, most notably his power, dynamis, his wisdom, sophia. God reveals himself in these various glories for good reason. No one name, says Basil, suffices to denote all the glories of God at the same time, and nor can any one name be used on its own without danger. He further insists that to know God in his attributes is in no way to exhaust the divine mystery. We say that we know the glory of God, Basil writes, his power, his wisdom, his goodness, his providence over us, and the justness of his judgment, but not his very essence. He who denies that he knows the essence does not confess himself to be ignorant of God. Because our conception of God is gathered from the many appellations which I have enumerated. We do have some knowledge of God on the basis of the attributes or appellations. So God remains unknowable, utterly unknowable in essence, even as he makes himself known in the glories pertaining to the essence. Basil goes on to affirm that to know God in such attributes does not undermine in any way at all the divine simplicity. The attributes are not to be understood as names of the essence. They are distinct from the essence. And the fact that they make known the essence of God in various ways does not make God in any way multiple. God reveals himself in his operations of remaining perfectly simple. As he puts it, the energies are various and the essence simple. We say that we know our God from his energies. We do not undertake to approach near to his essence. His energies come down to us, but his essence remains beyond our reach. We find a very similar set of formulations in St. Gregory of Nyssa. The divine attributes make known both the unity and distinction of Father, Son, and Spirit. One goodness, wisdom, justice, providence, power, incorruptibility. All other attributes of exalted meaning are simply predicated of each person, and each person has, in a certain sense, his strength in the other. And for Gregory, like Basil, Gregory of Nyssa still, it's through contemplations of such attributes we gain a notion of God. But this is a notion of his wisdom, goodness, etc., not of the essence. The essence remains utterly hidden to us. The God, says Gregory of Nyssa, who is by nature invisible, is visible in his energies or activities or operations, being perceived in the attributes that surround him, in the things that surround him, to surround the essence, things pertaining to the essence. He makes the same point in Tu Oblavius, or not three gods. All fitting terms make known not the divine essence itself, but some aspect of that which pertains to the essence or surrounds the essence. Such formulations, it seems to me, are not an obvious feature of St. Gregory Nazianzen's work. Gregory of Nazianzus, Gregory the theologian, does make use of an essence energies framework from time to time. He'll say, for example, we don't know the essence of God, but we do know something of him from his operations. But in this case, in the case of St. Gregory the theologian, I think Gregory is most likely speaking of created effects and not uncreated attributes pertaining to or around the essence. In any event, my chief point is that in focusing so much on St. Gregory of Nazianzus, Father Thomas Joseph misses this highly significant distinction between the essence and the glories pertaining to the essence. That is a key feature of the Cappadocian Brothers' Trinitarian theology, the brothers, Basil, Gregory of Nyssa. This distinction between the unnameable, unknowable, and ineffable essence, and the at least partly nameable, knowable, and if you like, effable or expressible attributes or glories pertaining to the essence sets up a highly significant trajectory within the Greek patristic tradition. Without, for the sake of time, going into all the details, I suggest this basic distinction, essence and energies or operations, essence and attributes, lies behind Dionysius's beneficent processions, St. Maximus the Confessor's higher and more exalted logoi, and St. Gregory Palamas's famous, or perhaps in this context, infamous divine energies. While these teachings are by no means identical in all respects, they all maintain a clear distinction between the utterly unnameable and unknowable divine essence, or even hyperousia, the beyond essence, as it's sometimes called, and the various glories or processions or logoi or energies by which God makes himself known in the realest possible way, incorporating human beings into the divine life through theosis. And this distinction is in no way a derogation of the divine simplicity, any more than is the distinction between the divine persons. On the contrary, this distinction is presented in these theologians as a necessary feature of Trinitarian theology, in which unity always goes hand in hand with distinction. And this intra-divine distinction which unites, to use a phrase from Dionysius, a distinction which unites, is also seen as a necessary underpinning of the doctrine of mystical union or deification. Now let's turn to Palamas here as we move towards a conclusion. The divinity in this Palamas significant pause there. The divinity in this Palamas is one and simple and undivided, and does not abandon the divine simplicity on account of the pious distinction according to the activities. But simplicity itself, and here he draws upon St. Gregory of Nazianzus, is to be acknowledged as among the attributes or energies or operations of God, since the essence remains utterly unnameable. God can be described as simplicity itself. He alone is not only perfectly simple, but simplicity itself, says Palamas. This is also evident when one examines the divine names. For God is not only living and wise and good, but goodness and wisdom and life. But none of these names, says Palamas, are properly names of the essence. Palamas insists that we cannot name the essence. We can, however, speak about the attributes, what the Cappadocian brothers call the glories pertaining to the essence. But these energies, these glories, nonetheless reveal something of the Trinitarian nature of God. The energies, important to understand, the patristic Palamite framework, are always and inescapably a Trinitarian operation. You know, sometimes the Palamas' system is painted as a form of vaguely Neoplatonic emanationism, in which you just have rays coming out of the divine essence. But it's important to recognize that they're always a Trinitarian operation. And here the basic principle goes back to the Sixth Ecumenical Council and the connection between nature and energy, where you have one nature, they have one energy, manifest in multiple ways in the creation. So the energies are not impersonal emanations. They come from the Father, through the Son, and are made known in the Spirit. To quote from Palamas' anti-Latin apodictic treatises, the Spirit eternally flows forth from the Father into the Son and becomes manifest in the saints from the Father through the Son. You see there the grammar of Trinitarian revelation in Palamas, and I'm arguing as you that should be evident that the energies give us a basis for speaking about God as Trinity. So the energies, to repeat, are always Trinitarian in character for Palamas. To quote from a slightly later work of his, the Trinitarian persons not only possess mutually the superessential essence, which is entirely unnameable, unrevealed, incommunicable, for it is above every name, manifestation, and participation. But the grace, the power, the operation, the brightness, the kingdom, the incorruption, and put simply, all the means by which God communicates and by which, according to grace, he is united with the holy angels and humans, without being deprived of his simplicity, either as a result of the divisibility and distinction of the hypostases, or as a result of the divisibility and multiplicity of the powers and operations or energies. Of course, this is a very different path to that followed by Augustine and after him, Aquinas. And in that understanding of divine simplicity, there's a demand that God be seen as identical with his attributes, that the attributes be identical with one another. Doubtless the two approaches, broadly Palamite, broadly Thomist, are formally incompatible. As I say, this alternative patristic trajectory of divine simplicity, largely missed in this book, gives us a robust basis on which to speak about God as both one and three, not only on the basis of the psychological analogy, but arguably on the rather firmer basis of God's own self-revelation to the saints, to the mystics, to all of us. So is this a Trinitarian ontology? Well, strictly speaking, no. There can be no logos, no discourse about the being of God qua essence. But we can speak about God on the basis of the Trinitarian self-disclosure qua energy, or attributes, actualizations, operations, etc. So Trinitarian ontology, no as pertains the essence, but yes as pertains the energies. But I don't want to end on a negative note. It seems to me that Father Thomas Joseph White's rigorous patristic Thomist, as we might call it, presentation of Trinitarian theology based on Aquinas can serve as an ally to the patristic Palamite tradition I've sketched here very briefly today. We both have serious qualms about the trajectory of much modern theology, and indeed of the modern world more generally. I don't want to say that we're pre-modern, and indeed, I don't like that term at all. I don't want to say we're pre-modern, and indeed the book shows admirably how fresh and timely Thomism can be in the contemporary theological scene. That's what best described as unmodern. But whatever we might want to call ourselves, I believe patristic Palamites and patristic Thomists have a great deal to gain from working together as devotees of a shared biblical and patristic tradition. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marcus, for this paper. And let me now invite Father Thomas's wife if he wants to start the dialogue, and then we have time to questions and comments.
Well, I'd like to thank Marcus for his beautifully eloquent and well thought out response. And it's wonderful having sat in classes with Bishop Callistos decades ago to now be sharing thoughts about the Trinity together here in the Eternal City. And, you know, it's nice to hear English spoken. It's so rare. As a person who comes from what did someone say? It left in English. It was born to a noble heritage in its mother country, and it left to America where it was thoroughly impoverished. Anyway, relentless protection and implacable progress of the Thomistic machine. I think I'm going to print that out. The best bumper sticker I've got. If we actually syndicated it on the Thomistic Institute website in America, we would sell thousands. I'm not even joking about the possibility. So let me just say first thing about mystical union. So I do think we probably do not have a substantial disagreement about this. My point in the beginning is that people who experience mystical union, who in the Catholic tradition are, you know, as I think as common as they are present in the Orthodox tradition, aren't called to the same office or responsibility as theologians. They have a higher, some of them are theologians. Aquinas was a mystic and a theologian, as was Bonaventure, but they are called to a different and in some way higher task. It's obvious when you read the letters of Mother Teresa that she experienced deep forms of mystical union. She wasn't a theologian in the same way that Aquinas is. And of course, people should seek to be theologians, seek mystical union and may experience it. But when they have experiences that are profoundly mystical, that doesn't necessarily directly make them better theologians. And they can make, for example, conceptual or historical errors despite having deep mystical experiences. So in the Dominican tradition, you know, we think of Catherine of Siena, who is a seriously theologically informed mystic. In the dialogue is a work in some ways of theology. The letters are a locus of theological reflection. She doesn't have the inner discipline of theological systematic reflection that Aquinas or Augustine or Bonaventure have, even if they were also mystics. And she doesn't comment scripture in the same way they do in trying to seek the signification of terms. However, we also learn something about mystical union from her or Catherine de' Ricci or other great Dominican saints of mystical union, Martin de Porres being another example, that we wouldn't necessarily learn from the theologians. So I would like to recognize that and just say that I see these as organically related, but not reducible to one another, but nevertheless inseparable in aspiration and in social union. Regarding the Cappadocians, you totally read right what I did. I see there are issues in Nyssa that I'm concerned about. One of them is apophaticism. I am made highly nervous by the idea of the decoupling of sameness of essence from oneness in being. That's in the Latin consubstantialiter. And that would be an interesting argument to pursue. I want to maintain sameness of essence and oneness of being. And I often say one in essence and being to underscore the couplet. I do think that that way of reading the homoousios formula is historically defensible as a development of the doctrine, but it could be unpacked more. Nissa's deep apophaticism is something I have grave reservations about, unless it's complemented by something like the cataphatic elements in Nazianzus. And I try to bring the two ideas together in the reading of Dionysius, who is also a Greek referent, without passing through the proto-Palamite ideas that one can find in those authors. This is not so much because of a despair of constructive engagement with Palamas, but because of a sense of reservation about what I could competently do on Palamas, who is a whole field of expertise that is outside my competency. So I think what you suggest about Palamites thinking on, in essence and energies, divine naming, Trinitarian knowledge, and also filioque engagement is all very interesting to me. I think that that could be very prosperous. And going back to the Orthodox question, yesterday, I could have and I should have actually just mentioned kind of Palamite school of theology as a school I would see, and I really mean this, sort of like, obviously a little further in some respects away, but like the engagement between Dominicans and Franciscans on the Trinity, you could have the Palamites. And I do believe the church has to have space for different traditions and schools of thinking, and then explore convergences. And I think that notion of schools can transcend the distinction between Eastern and Western realizations of Christianity. And there could be constructive forms of apophaticism that could be too readily ignored in the West that need to be re-engaged with in the East, just as there could be the emphasis on mystical experience in the East. But I do think that there's also conceptual rigor and luminous, I would say probably theologically luminous reflection in the Augustinian and Western and Thomistic traditions to help us maintain the minimal, I'd say deeply necessary characterizations of the inner life of God that must be stated if we are to really affirm eternal Trinity as the deepest ground of reality. So I see those as complementary movements rather than opposed. I will allow myself now to make a reflection that is a little bit, as the kids say, meta. It's interesting to note, this is going to your point about being non-modern, pre-modern. We are both modern people who take inspiration from pre-modern sources who speak more deeply to us than some of the more contemporary, important, robust Trinitarian experiments of the 20th century, which I call lively. Because there's like lots that there, I think it's like it's a wealth of intuitions, not sufficiently grounded in the tradition. And so I'm trying to say, well, maybe we could have a sifting using the tradition to go forward and developing the life of the tradition in light of the lively intuitions that are somewhat unregulated or maybe unrefined in some of the more experimental modern thinkers. I don't think that that's a non-modern thing to do. I actually think modernity also means a lot of intellectual creativity and freedom to engage in history, to recover and retrieve and creatively re-implement the intuitions of the past. And so in that sense, I think that historical theologians are modern in a very constructive way by revolting against the necessary norms assigned to us by people who may be insufficiently reflective. In that sense, I do think that I aspire to have a deep alliance with people who believe in the importance of the patristic traditions in the book. Now, let me say a meta point though about the tonism and terror. So, one thing that's interesting is when you start to write more systematically about Aquinas, people say, go back into your historical study, because by leaving history and doing Thomism, you're becoming a dangerous person. You're a dangerous person because you're creating a monolithic, non-sufficiently historical, incautiously absolutist conceptual project that could seduce people into thinking there's one way of doing theology in the church and become quasi-totalitarian. And Okay, that's interesting. It's a theme in this conference, and it's a common, and I don't think there's anything individual about that. I mean, it's individuals who hold Platonists, so I think there's individuals only. It's an individual reaction that's very indicative of much wider reaction, not only outside the Dominican order, and not even outside of people who study Aquinas. But let me say this. I think that if you consider which of the modern Catholic theologians has exerted the most influence of all, just not from the point of having the office of the papacy, someone like Ratzinger, but from the power of his thought in the 20th century, I really only think there's one answer to the question. And I think the answer is Karl Rahner. Now we could debate that, but surely he's one of the most influential. And I think the reason is that because he is a systematic thinker, who's not very historical, who has almost no footnotes in his writing, who never cites the Bible or exegetes it, but who has a comprehensive interpretation of reality from top to bottom and of all the Catholic dogmas in light of a unified theological anthropology. He provides a systematic way of being a modern Christian, modern Catholic Christian, that can be considered, that can be understood, that has a finite but somewhat profound vocabulary, and that can be, you might say, communicated universally. The power of Rahnerian thought, even if it's now maybe not as normative as it was, I think it's still in some ways the most normative form of thought in the church today. The power of Rahnerian thought stems in part from its systematic and universal form of reflection. And although I rejoice and believe deeply, and it's not simply a symbolic statement, I believe deeply in the recovery of historical sources and rejoice in the wealth of patristic and medieval studies done, I do think we have to pass, this is the meta point, to the systematic moment. And one of the subjacent presuppositions of the book is that Aquinas allows us to pass to the systematic moment in ways that allow us to respect the past, to continue to learn from it, and to engage in genuine conversation with a wealth of contemporary interlocutors without seeking to be a omnicompetent resource for the conditions of possibility of all theological reflection for all branches of Christianity today. At the same time, I mean, that's a delicate thing to affirm, because you're saying, okay, Aquinas can help us think systematically, engage in conversation with everybody, but at the same time, we're not claiming thereby that all schools of thought or traditions lose their right to engage, or may be sources of learning for the church that are not found in the Thomistic tradition. But I think that standpoint in the end is unavoidable for anyone. Everyone tends towards some kind of systematic framework. They work with intuitions about what they think is universally true. And insofar as they do, they come to theological conclusions that place them at odds with members of other theological schools and traditions. So we are just involved in that process. And I think Aquinas can be in that way foreboding, but it's also potentially inviting if Thomists conduct themselves well and rightly. But I would just finish with this last point, which is just a little bit the other direction, and say, would that Orthodox theologians engaged in literature with Augustine and Aquinas as much as I have with the Greek fathers, because as poor as my own engagement with them is, I would say, there's plenty of work to do from the other side. And I think that you are a total exception to that, obviously. I know, like one of the great exceptions, but I think there needs to be more, reception of the Western tradition too, in terms of thinking about how the Eastern traditions can speak to us and with us, because I do think we're taking our initiatives. I don't say they're sufficient, but I think there needs to be initiative also from the other side. And I understand that we've created partly the defensive posture of the East, but I also believe the counter movement is the best remedy to the defect. So thank you very much. I guess we'll open for questions.
So we have almost 10 minutes for questions and dialogues.
Thank you for your paper. I'm a second-year licensed student, so I preface my question to say that I humbly bring this question to the table, that a lot of what we've been talking about is apophaticism. And perhaps point of dialogue between Palamas and Thomas Aquinas' approach could be seen. I know that Joseph Pieper writes in Silence of St. Thomas about how God is sort of unknowable in a way that because he communicates so much of himself. There's so much self-communication that, for example, the intelligibility of creation, there's a mystery there in our ability to know, reality, because it has so much intelligibility. Is it true that with Palamas and perhaps some of the other Eastern views of apophaticism, that it's not so much that God is so communicative, or it doesn't come across that way, that maybe he's even withholding himself in some way? There's something that he's holding back. Is that a fair criticism of the apophatic approach of Palamas, and maybe a point of conversation between Thomas and Palamonians? Is that how you say it?
I was wondering if this is on.
Oh, sorry.
So this is
There button. Thanks. Well, wonderful. That's you prefix it saying that was a very simple, humble question. Sometimes the simplest, humblest questions are the most profound. And I think you've brought us to think about some very important questions here. Palamas and Aquinas, notion of mystery. When we speak about God as mystery, when we speak about apophatic theology, it doesn't mean we know nothing about God. This is not the Occamite approach or the Kantian approach. Just do not approach. Nothing can be said, but we know in part. And of course, I would dare to say Palamas and Aquinas are both trying to balance the unknowability and the knowability of God. They're both trying to reconcile the apophatic and the cataphatic. So for both Palamas and Aquinas, a mystery is something we know only in part, we don't know nothing about. And of course, there are different ways of speaking about what we do know and what we don't know. So in Aquinas, as I understand it, you have a sense, say, of the beatific vision, and correct me if I get this wrong, that human beings may come to apprehend God, but not comprehend God. Is that right? So in other words, even in the Thomist tradition, there's always a sense of God exceeding our capacity to know and understand, even in the beatific vision. Now, in the Palamite, patristic Palamite, I would say this is very much the expression of an earlier tradition, going back at least as far as the Cappadocian brothers, if not further. But anyhow, in the sort of Palamite expression of the Greek patristic tradition, the vision of God, theosis, begins in this life. I mean, this is a big difference. But of course, it's only completed in the next life. But again, you have an analogous tension between what we do know and what we do not know about God. And Palamas' solution is to put what we do not know about God in the category of ousia, and what we do know about God in the category of energy or attributes or actualizations or operations or activities. There's a whole host of English words that can be used to render the Greek energies. And to be honest, I try not to overuse energies because people just think about batteries and electricity and things. So what we do know about God goes in the box marked energies or whatever, attributes, etc. Now, this is not to say, as I emphasized, that there's a divide, ultimately. We often talk about, people often trot out the line, oh, Palamas has a real distinction between essence and activities in God. He never uses the term real distinction. He would even use the term conceptual distinction. But this is something actual. In other words, it's not just in our minds. But it amounts to saying, in a different form of words, we know of God only that which God reveals to us. So it's a very simple route, way of reconciling divine unknowability from divine knowability. God makes himself known to us, and our capacity to know God is necessarily limited. And he'll even speak about the kind of change that needs to happen, say, to the apostles at the Transfiguration to enable them to see the divine light, a change in the operation of the senses, as Palamas calls it in his homily on the Transfiguration. And a Thomist might call that creative grace, enabling the creature to receive the uncreated light of the Transfiguration. So as I say, I think we have an analogous effort to reconcile apophaticism and cataphaticism in the Palamite tradition, in the Thomist tradition, not, as I say, formally compatible, perhaps on a deeper level, compatible as necessarily limited human approaches to the divine mystery.
Yeah, time for another question.
Oh, okay. So, Marcus, thank you for your lecture. And I must preface my question by saying that I have not read Father White's book. So I guess, I'm just directing the question largely to you. In light of what you just said, that, we all are familiar with the scholastic claim of the fact that, all Trinitarian relations are relations of opposition. And this is not something that you really brought up in your conversation here. Would you say that this claim is in discontinuity with the broader Cappadocian tradition that you sort of outlined? Is it something that you could subscribe to as an Orthodox theologian, or do you see a problem there?
Well, I would say it's in discontinuity insofar as it's not clearly precedented in the tradition. But is it fundamentally foreign to the tradition?
Yeah.
I mean, in the book, we speak about the Thomas Joseph, but there's a certain amount on how, say, Thomas's notion of subsistent relations is related to, not in any kind of sense of direct dependence, but it has something to do with the way in which St. Gregory the theologian talks about the names of the persons being names of the relations. But on the particular issue of opposite relations, that's something Orthodox theologians have often attacked. Even someone like St. Mark of Ephesus, who's a great anti-unionist, but actually quite an avid reader of Thomas at the same time, regards as totally foreign to the tradition. So it's something obviously is a very different way of expressing Trinitarian theology, but in discontinuity of the patristic tradition, as far as it's not precedented there, but I wouldn't go so far to say it's utterly opposed to the patristic tradition.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I think we are on time to have a 5 minutes break just to take fresh air, drink a little bit of water, and then we come back here to the final discussion of this workshop. And let me thank once more Marcus for this